The first automobile was created in 1886, and since their initial creation, it's now an industry that's worth billions worldwide. Cars are often a source of pride, with people having their own taste in what they do and don't like. Today, we're going to talk about the history of one of the world's largest car manufacturers, Volkswagen. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe, but without further ado, let's get into it. On May 28, 1937, the German government, led by none other than Adolf Hitler, decided to start a state-owned automobile company. This company was known as, and I do apologise to our German viewers, Gesellschaft zur Verbreitung des deutschen Volkswagens, which means the Society for the Preparation of the German People's Car. This was later shortened to Volkswagenwerk, which means the People's Car Company. They planned to use the German Labour Front, which was a Nazi organisation, to mass produce an affordable, yet speedy vehicle that would cost just under 1,000 Reichsmarks, which was about $140 at the time. When it came down to who was going to design the car, Hitler called in an Austrian automotive engineer called Ferdinand Porsche. Now, as we know, Hitler loved a good old Nazi rally, and in one of these rallies in 1938 he made a statement about the people's car, and he said, "It is for the broad masses that this car has been built. Its purpose is to answer their transportation needs and is intended to give them joy." The Nazis during this time also ran a state-owned leisure organisation called Strength Through Joy. This led to the people's car being named the Strength Through Joy car. Unfortunately, the car with the catchy name was soon shelved, as just after its appearance at the 1939 Berlin Motor Show, World War II began. The first order of business was to transition the Volkswagen factory, which was called the City of the KDF car, from making civilian vehicles to military ones. It's said that even when not at war, the factory never had enough staff to be able to function properly. Now, as we know, Germany at this time wasn't really known for being a leader in human rights, and according to the Holocaust Encyclopedia, Volkswagen became one of the first companies to use forced labour within its factories, including a large number of Soviet prisoners of war, as well as many Jewish concentration camp workers. Forced labour eventually made up over 60% of the workers at the factory. As the war came to a conclusion and the Allies closed in on the factory in 1945, the prisoners left the Volkswagen factory too and looted a nearby town. The factory manager, Anton Piesch, fled the factory to the estate of his father-in-law, who was none other than Ferdinand Porsche. Porsche and Piesch were held by French authorities for 2 years. However, despite the part they played in the German war effort, they were never charged and both died as free men. After the war ended, the factory was in ruins. The Allies made Volkswagen the focus of their attempts to resurrect the German auto industry. In a sort of rebranding, the British occupying forces urged that the Volkswagen plant at Fallersblenn and the City of the KDF car were renamed to Wolfsburg. This is still the main headquarters of the company to this day. There were many at the top of the Allied forces who wanted to see the death of German industry altogether, which included Volkswagen. If it wasn't for one man named Major Ivan Hurst, this probably would have been the case. Hurst was tasked with disassembling the factory, but he saw the potential that his superiors didn't. Being an engineer, he was always impressed with the capability of Volkswagen vehicles that were captured throughout the war. He came up with an idea: to find a car that was still in good shape, paint it as camouflage, and suggest that Volkswagen should be used in place of damaged Allied vehicles. The military hierarchy agreed, and on August 22nd, work began on a contract for 20,000 Volkswagens, along with 500 trailers and 500 military vehicles. It was Hurst's creative thinking that saved the company. They began production on the 27th of December 1945, and by March 1946 they celebrated the completion of their 1,000th car. By the end of 1946 they'd made over 10,000, and the turnover was standing at 55 million Deutschmarks. By the end of 1946 they'd made over 10,000, and the turnover was standing at 55 million Deutschmarks. And another year later in 1947 they secured their first export deal. The company had been under British supervision ever since the war ended, but this all changed in 1949 when the control of the company was transferred to the West German government and the state of Lower Saxony. By that time, more than half of the passenger cars produced in the country were Volkswagens. Volkswagen remained owned by the West German government until 1960, when 60% of the company's shares were made public. The 1950s is where we begin to see the rapid expansion of VW, mainly in part due to the release of their Transporter in 1950 and the Karmann Ghia Coupe in 1955. Sales outside of Germany were also very strong, with the exception of the United States. The rounded shapes of their vehicles coupled with their ties to the Nazi Party meant many Americans were sceptical to buy a Volkswagen. In 1955, Volkswagen of America was founded, and their aspirations to win the hearts and minds of the American people was in full force. In 1959, they opted to work with a company called Doyle Dane Bernbach. This company was responsible for the advertising of the Beetle and focused on pushing the car's size and unique look to the American consumer. Whatever they did certainly worked, because over the next few years, Volkswagen sales skyrocketed. and it soon became the most popular imported vehicle in America. A few years later in 1965, they purchased Audi and it became part of the VW family, which would become the first of many brands they would gain control of, but more on that later. The Beetle became Volkswagen's flagship vehicle. American exports, innovative advertising, and a growing reputation for reliability helped production figures surpass levels of the previous record holder, the Ford Model T. Other car companies began to create smaller cars to compete with the powerhouse that was Volkswagen. However, it would appear that they felt the pressure, because during the 1970s they moved away from trying to be the black sheep of the auto industry. For example, they stopped making rear-engine cars and replaced them with front-engine, front-wheel drive vehicles. It looked like the love for VW was wearing off. That was until the release of the Golf, or the Rabbit as it was called in the US. This Golf picked up where the Beetle left off and became an instant success. In 1980, sales of VW began to slump in both the US and Canada. Sales in the United States were 293,000 in 1980, but by 1984 they were down to 177,000. As we know, when a company is struggling, changes need to be made in order to get back on the right track, and in September 1982, Volkswagen did just that. They signed a cooperation agreement with SEAT, a Spanish manufacturer. Volkswagen acquired a 51% controlling stake in SEAT by June 1986. This made it the first non-German subsidiary of the Volkswagen Group. It became a major shareholder in December the same year, with its stake being increased to 75%. By 1990, SEAT was a subsidiary of Volkswagen AG. This was the start of VW's spending spree. In 1991 they began a joint partnership with Skoda, and by 2000 had full control. Around the same time Lamborghini and Bugatti were also acquired, and a decade later Porsche and Suzuki followed suit. It's incredible to think that VW, a company that was nearly dismantled if not for one man, was now swallowing up companies left, right and centre and turning over billions in the process. In 2015, things took a less positive turn when a scandal hit the news that VW was cheating on emissions tests. The Environmental Protection Agency in the US found that diesel VW cars, including the Jetta, Beetle, Golf and Passat, had what were called defeat devices. This basically meant that software in the cars knew when they were being tested for emissions, so would change their performance to improve test results. The result? The engines in these vehicles emitted nitrogen oxide pollutants up to 40 times what is allowed in the US. When questioned about this, VW America boss Michael Horn said, "We've totally screwed up." I mean, at least the guy's honest. But VW ended up setting aside €6.7 billion to cover the costs of the scandal and reported its first quarterly loss in 15 years. As of the 1st of June 2020, the scandal had cost an eye-watering €33.3 billion in fines, penalties, financial settlements and buyback costs. Don't get me wrong, this was obviously very unethical, but when you look at the origins of VW, this definitely doesn't look so bad. And it would appear they learnt their lesson, because in 2017 they unveiled plans to invest an incredible amount of their resources to creating electric vehicles. By 2025 they aim to have launched at least 30 EV models and want 20 to 25% of their total yearly sales to consist of electric vehicles. Despite their questionable origins and recent scandal, Volkswagen is still a staple of the auto industry. Last year they made a revenue of €222 billion. Their willingness to embrace the future of electric vehicles, coupled with their strong business model based on mergers and acquisitions, will make them a formidable foe in the auto industry for many decades to come. As always, thank you very much for watching the History Of. If you did enjoy today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and maybe just leave a comment down below with any suggestions you have for future videos. And thank you for being on the right side of history.